From London, this is the Orwellians podcast. I'm Roland Elliott Brown. My guest today is Lucy Ash. Lucy is an award-winning journalist and broadcaster, most often for the BBC. She is also the author of The Baton and The Cross, Russia's Church from Pagans to Putin. Lucy, welcome.
Thank you very much for having me, Roland.
Before Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022, many analysts of Russia were full of rational-sounding reasons as to why such aggression wouldn't happen. Russia had too much money in Western banks, for example, or was too dependent on energy deals with Europe. But Putin didn't frame the war in exclusively rational terms. Indeed, on the eve of the war, he made quite a strange comment saying, Ukraine is not just a neighboring country for us, it is an inalienable part of our own history, culture, and spiritual space. What did he mean by that?
Well, I mean, as you know, and as everyone's been saying for a long time, not just Putin, but many people in Russia struggle with the idea that Ukraine is an independent sovereign country. And back in 2008 at a NATO summit, Putin was telling George W. Bush that Ukraine isn't a real country. But most famously in July 2021, about 8 months before the full-scale invasion, he spent quite a big chunk of his summer holiday writing a history essay about the relationships between Russians and Ukrainians. And he talked about Kiev as the mother of Russian cities, that it's the place where the Eastern Slavs first converted to Orthodox Christianity. So when he says Ukraine is part of Russia's spiritual space, that's what he means, that they go back to this baptismal font. But humiliatingly for both Putin and Patriarch Kirill, the head of the Russian Orthodox Church, this baptismal font is located in a country that doesn't want to have anything more to do with them, that wants to be spiritually and politically independent. And, in many ways, there have been various reasons advanced for the justification for the invasion, unprovoked invasion, I should say, of a neighbouring country. But one of them is that this is part of Russia's spiritual domain and needs to be protected. There's talk of NATO encroachment. There's talk of the fact that Ukraine wants to be part of the European Union that insists on holding gay pride parades, and that means that the West is falling into Satanism, and Russia has to step in and protect Ukraine from falling into the clutches of this monstrous godlessness in the West. But he feels, and Patriarch Kirill feel, that this is their co-religionists, their land, their churches, that they were being robbed of that when Ukraine took the decision to have its own self-governing church back in 2018. Maybe we'll talk about that later. But,
right, that was my next question. So you mentioned in the book that, well, there were big religious changes going on among Ukrainian Orthodox believers on the eve of the war. There was an independence movement among Orthodox Christians seeking independence from the Moscow Patriarchate. And you even describe it as a casus belli. What was going on there?
Well, I met a young abbot of a monastery in Lviv who told me that much to the disgust of his father, who was fighting on the Ukrainian side in the Donbass, since 2014, since the insurrectionists backed by Moscow exploded after the annexation of Crimea, back then. He felt very much that he wanted to be part of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church Moscow Patriarchate. That's the church that's been connected to Moscow in Ukraine for 300 years. Partly, he said, because this is up until the full-scale invasion, partly because he thought that it was much more intellectually and canonically sound, that, the most well-read and respected bishops belonged to that part of the church. And then he said that he had a total sort of horror when he realized what had happened with the full-scale invasion. And so he broke away from Moscow and came under the Patriarchate of Constantinople. This is quite a confusing picture, but basically, after the independence of Ukraine, when the Soviet Union fell apart, there were lots of people in Ukraine that thought, we have political independence, we should also have spiritual independence from the mother church in Moscow. And there were various competing churches, competing personalities, but in the end, the president before Volodymyr Zelensky, Petro Poroshenko, managed to get the Patriarch of Constantinople, who is based in Istanbul, modern-day Istanbul, and is considered in the Orthodox world first among equals, because the Church of Constantinople is the oldest Orthodox church. It's where Constantine founded the Eastern Orthodox, Eastern Christian religion. This ceremony happened in 2018, and so it's very confusing because the two churches have very similar names. There's the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, which used to have MP after its name, meaning Moscow Patriarchate. But now it says it's just the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, although it still has, scores of bishops that are still, under Moscow. At least that's the way that Moscow sees it, because it has pictures of them on their calendar that they put out once a year. Then there's the Orthodox Church of Ukraine, the OCU. So their names are very similar. But after the full-scale invasion, there were quite a lot of Ukrainians that decided they didn't want to go to the liturgy in which Patriarch Kirill of Moscow's name was being mentioned, celebrated, because he had been calling upon, basically upon the Russian troops to annihilate people in Ukraine. So they thought, how can I go and pray, if you like, for my own genocide? It doesn't really make sense. So quite a lot of people at that point demanded that their priests swap sides, or sometimes it was the priest himself who decided he wanted to move jurisdictions. Like at the beginning of my book, I talk about a priest in Bobrик, which is just outside Kiev, and he was forced at gunpoint to hand over the keys to his church, and they put Russian snipers in his belfry, in the bell tower, for the horrendous month that they occupied that area. This is at the time that the atrocities were being committed in Bucha, Irpin, and other places. So he said, I'm not going to go back to that church. Sometimes it was the parishioners that decided. But then I've also come across cases where there are parishioners who don't want to move to the newly autocephalous or self-governing church because they feel that if they do, they will be uncanonical. And this is a very, very powerful idea to many people. They think, to put it crudely, if they change churches, they won't go to heaven. They'll lose divine grace. And this was the opinion of a woman that sat next to me in a minibus when I went on a pilgrimage to Pochayev, which is one of Kiev's great monasteries. And she had come from the town of Bucha, where, hundreds of civilians were killed and people were raped and all kinds of atrocities committed. She was in the cellar with her daughter for 3 weeks. But she said she would not join the new church because she thought that it was created for political reasons, she said, and she didn't believe that it was canonically sound. So it's quite a messy picture, and it's one that a lot of outsiders don't automatically understand. And it's quite easy for this to be manipulated by Russian propaganda, for Moscow to talk about the fact that people in Ukraine are being denied their religious freedoms. It is true that some priests have been arrested by the Ukrainian security services, the SBU, because they've been suspected of preaching sort of Russian world propaganda, and in some instances they've been convicted of actually helping the Russian army to locate positions where the Ukrainian army is, and straightforward acts of treason. Sometimes it's just they are Russian passport holders, and they make no bones about the fact that they feel very much still linked to Moscow.
Right.
So yeah, it's a complicated picture.
So the Moscow Patriarchate has influence in Ukraine, has influence in other places. I've heard tell of churches in London where prayers are said for Patriarch Kirill and for the Russian armed forces. Maybe we should dive into Patriarch Kirill and his reaction to the war and his participation in Kremlin propaganda about the war.
Yeah, well, the first few days he didn't say very much at all, except that efforts should be made to minimize the bloodshed, which is the kind of thing you would expect the head of a church to say. But
it also suggests maybe he was caught by surprise, like a lot of people in high places in Moscow.
There's quite a lot of evidence that he wasn't particularly happy about the annexation of Crimea, because he saw that would maybe make the Moscow Patriarchate and his church and his power, it would kind of perhaps belittle him or cut his influence in Ukraine. And he was trying to play a game where he kept people on side.
That's come true, I guess. Yeah,
I think that he may have been taken by surprise, because most people were. I mean, there's the famous story about the oligarch who rushed into the Kremlin to try find out what was going on the morning of the invasion, and ran into Sergei Lavrov, the foreign minister, and said, why did Putin do this? What's the reason? And who told him it was a good idea to invade Ukraine? And Lavrov says, he's only got 3 advisors: Ivan the Terrible, Catherine the Great, and Peter the Great, and sort of walked off in the opposite direction down the corridor. So, I mean, it seemed almost like Sergei Lavrov hadn't been asked about it either. We're talking about decisions being made in a very small circle of advisors, in which perhaps Putin was detached from the reality on the ground. But so at the beginning there was an element of surprise maybe, but very soon Kirill seemed to switch tack. And by Forgiveness Sunday, which was just about a fortnight into the full-scale war, that's when he made his famous assertion that one of the reasons for the war was to protect Ukrainians from these gay pride parades that people in the West demand as a sign that you follow their ideology. And then, it became more and more extreme. So by September 2022, when there was a partial mobilization, he was saying that anybody who fell fighting on Russia's side in the battlefield in Ukraine was kind of going to go to heaven and they'd be washed of their sins. It sounds a very jihadist proposal, but in jihad, you're killing infidels, whereas in this war, you have Orthodox brother fighting Orthodox brother. I mean, not everyone in Ukrainian is Orthodox. Especially in the West, there's a lot of Eastern Rite Catholics, Uniates, the Greek Catholic Church in Ukraine. There's also, quite a number of Tatars who are Muslim. There are Jews, but I mean the overwhelming. There are Protestants, obviously, in Eastern Ukraine especially, but most Christians in Ukraine are Orthodox. And there is Kirill sort of saying that Russian soldiers are going to be washed of their sins and go to heaven for killing their brethren, or for fighting in the battlefield against their brethren, at least. And it sort of goes in the face of Orthodox teaching. If you go back to the 4th century and the Desert Fathers, who are the sort of greats of the Orthodox Church, Basil said that it was advisable, if you had to kill in a war in self-defense, not an aggressive war, but a defensive war, you should refrain from taking communion for at least 3 years and reflect on the fact that you've committed this sin, because obviously one of the 10 Commandments is thou shalt not kill. So it became increasingly obvious that Kirill was not following any of the precepts of Christianity as we understand it. He was going back to a sort of medieval paradigm of the Crusades and Holy War. And by 2024, the All-Russian World People's Council that he chairs declared that this war against Ukraine was a holy war. So it's sort of absolutely clear that he was going to give a spiritual imprimatur to Putin's land grab. And, for Putin, it's very handy that Kirill is legitimizing the war in that way and making it sound like something that is transcendental and kind of important to the spiritual survival of Russia as a nation. Not that Russia, as the largest country in the world, needs more land, because it's never really been a war about territory. It's a war of ideology.
I think I heard Garry Kasparov say that for Putin, as for Stalin, land is hard currency.
Yeah, that's true. It's a way of buying his way into respect, he believes, this respect that was denied him. And this war is doubtless fueled by a huge sense of resentment that he hasn't been the player on the world stage that he believes he deserves to be. And it's, the way that Stalin drew borders in an arbitrary way, we're kind of seeing a repeat of that in Novorossiya, in these occupied parts of Ukraine.
So the Russian line, current Russian rationalization endorsed by Patriarch Kirill is really quite extraordinary. It's that we have to gain control in Ukraine because the source of our religion is being taken over by, like, roughly speaking, westernized secular liberals. That seems to be the crux of it for the Kremlin and for Kirill.
Yeah, and very much so. And so there's a return to what I see as the times of Ivan the Terrible, in a way, and his book of household rules. Because one of my motivations for writing the book initially was, I was very concerned about the war in the Donbass. I'd made a film about a bakery on the front line, and I could see how much misery it was causing. But I was also horrified by the church's response when I made a film about domestic violence in 2019. 2 years before that, the Duma, the Russian parliament, had basically downgraded the offence of domestic violence. So if you hit your wife or your partner, and it wasn't sort of that bad that it needed hospitalization, or, it's just a quick trip to the A&E, accident and emergency, or what you call the emergency room in America, then it was just like getting a slap on the wrist, like a parking ticket, just a small fine. There was one MP in the Duma who was a Putin loyalist, really, but she was horrified by this because she said, basically this gives people the right to kind of beat up their whole family with impunity, and she wanted there to be a law brought in, restraining orders for violent partners. And she was completely vilified and hounded out of the Duma, out of the parliament. But her biggest opponents were senior clerics in the Russian Orthodox Church that lobbied the Kremlin until this law was kind of basically watered down to the point where it didn't make sense anymore. And there was a ultra-Orthodox businessman who said that if this law came to pass, it would be the genocide of the Russian family. Various clerics thought that it was very bad to kind of give women the say over, whether men should be allowed back into the household, that it would lead to kind of a breakdown of family relations and morality. And then you have like this famous priest, Andrei Tkachov, who gives incredibly incendiary sermons talking about nuking Ukraine. But he was saying back then that a woman has to be hit in the face at least once in her life or she won't understand anything, that women should be kind of bundled into a washing machine and stripped of their horns. Just a lot of very, very misogynistic, violent speech against women. And the church, rather than protecting some of the most vulnerable people in society, like women and children that are getting beaten up by drunken partners and husbands and fathers, it sort of decided that it was going to stand with the patriarchy. And that shocked me. And in retrospect, I think that it's understandable. It was, the MP who was hounded out of the Duma, who now lives in California, Oksana Pushkina, she said that she thought she was naive to think she was going to get this law through because society as a whole was being sort of readied for violence. The sort of tolerance and public appetite for violence was kind of being increased. So people would come to accept it as something completely everyday and banal. I started doing this film because there were some very famous cases that grabbed the headlines. One was a man who dragged his wife into a forest and cut both her wrists off with an axe. Another was three sisters who murdered their father because he'd been sexually abusing them for years and years. And so people were talking very much about domestic abuse. And all of this, going back to Ivan the Terrible, in his Book of Household Rules, it's all part and parcel of running a family along the right lines, keep the women in check.
Well, a couple of things that strike me. One is that dictatorship is kind of domestic abuse in macrocosm.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, if you think about that meeting with Macron, when Putin was saying to Zelensky that he should accept the Minsk agreements and accept their version of what was going to happen in the Donbass. And he said he had that sort of vulgar Russian ditty, хочется, не хочется, терпи, красавица, whether you like it or not, my beauty, you're going to have to put up with it.
It's very revealing, yeah.
Like a rape threat, isn't it?
Yeah.
And I feel like that's kind of writ large in macro terms.
The other thing that strikes me is that all of these men returning from the war in Ukraine with their psychological problems and their habits of brutality are going to take those right into the Russian home with total impunity.
Well, they have been already. I mean, there's been a lot of work by Russian journalists about a number of murders that have been committed by men coming back. Yeah, I mean, I'm not quite sure about the exact number, but there's been a definite spike. And in a way, that's not surprising when, you know, they let murderers and rapists go and sign up for the war, you know, got them out of prison and they got a pardon for it. So it does give a great sense that, you know, might is right and you can do what you like with impunity. And then, you know, I mean, it's not just, unfortunately, Russian men coming back from the battlefield who are going to suffer from PTSD, you know, and are going to take it out on their families. I'm sure it's going to happen in the Ukrainian households as well, but the Ukrainians are already aware of this and on board and, like, being very proactive about training more psychotherapists and things like that to deal with it all.
More of those unwanted Western liberal ideas.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, well, the Russians, they stick to kind of parapsychology, superstition. These are all really important forces. And, you know, despite the talk of Christianity, I think, you know, there's been a lot of talk about the fact that Putin went with Shoigu to see a shaman when he was making up his mind about the invasion.
This seems to be coming up a lot. Came up in my last podcast, actually.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that Russians are quite superstitious anyway. I mean, I'm speaking as someone, I'm quite superstitious. I never can, like, stand still on an escalator. I have to walk up it. Don't walk under ladders, you know. I avoid certain kind of paving
ladders are quite
stones.
sensible.
Well, ladders are maybe sensible.
You could knock the ladder over, you never know.
But when it comes to this idea of fetishizing objects of art, like, you know, famous icons, and moving them from the National Gallery into the Cathedral of Christ the Saviour, because you think it'll be like some sort of magic talisman that will improve your troops' chances on the battlefield, it's a different matter, I think. So, yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of concern that Putin had over his health during the COVID pandemic, and see in China, he's kind of obsessed with longevity and all of those things, like living forever. Hopefully not, but I think superstition is a really big element in Russia. And in the early 90s, when I was there was this paranormal guy, Kashpirovsky, that claimed that he could he could hypnotize people at long distance, and they could have operations and feel no pain. And yeah, somebody I knew when he came on the TV, she'd put bottles of water in front of the television, thinking that he would somehow radiate his power into these bottles of water.
Russia's very X-Files. It's very X-Filesy.
Yeah, there's a lot of that kind of thing.
Yeah. Well, I guess in fairness, America can be quite X-Filesy as well. Let's juxtapose our current moment with a moment from late Cold War history. So back in 1983, when the Cold War was still very cold, former KGB head Yuri Andropov was leader of the Soviet Union. Ronald Reagan gave his famous Evil Empire speech. The speech was partly about domestic politics, partly about Reagan's desire to promote what he called traditional values in the U.S. It was also a challenge to the Soviet Union. Reagan said that the Soviet abandonment of religion was in favor of state power, centralized state power, was what made it the focus of evil in the modern world. If we listen to the speeches of Putin and Kirill post-2022, which also emphasize traditional values, they almost sound like they're feeding Reagan back to the West in a kind of non-democratic parody form. And I think it's worth asking how the Kremlin and the Russian Church have managed to flip the script to such an extent that so many U.S. Republicans are now unwilling to support Ukraine.
Yeah, well, this is something that has really exercised me a lot. And last spring, I went to Texas to meet a group of people, converts to the Russian Orthodox Church. It's ROKOR, it's called Russian Orthodox Church outside Russia, or it's sometimes called the Russian Orthodox Church abroad. Mm-hmm. I mean, in absolute terms, the numbers converting to Orthodoxy are quite small in the American religious landscape, but they make a lot of noise online, and they seem to have quite a lobbying power on Capitol Hill. Anyway, I mean, I
would also add there's a very prominent conservative writer, Rod Dreher, who is Eastern Orthodox and is great buddies with J.D. Vance.
Exactly. These people have a sort of, very powerful sway, I would say, on what happens and are able to distort things. The reasons for some people converting to Orthodoxy are quite straightforward. It was a pandemic, people were on their own a lot, isolated, looking for answers, thinking about their immortality, and looking for a religion that seemed really old and genuine, and they got excited in the ideas of orthodoxy. And we're not just talking about Russian, because there's also Greek and Antiochian and other brands, but the people I met were from the Russian Orthodox Church. And then some of them, a lot of them were young men, like the overwhelming majority were young men who felt a bit ill at ease, I would say, in the modern world. They thought that evangelical churches were kind of too woke and too pro-women, too feminized. Well, one priest said to me, I don't want to go to church and think I'm at a Taylor Swift concert. All this Jesus is my boyfriend stuff I don't like. I want to go to a proper masculine church that, embodies masculine values. And they like the fact that the Lent is kind of stricter and that you can't sit down during the liturgy and those kinds of things. But in terms of their view of the war in Ukraine, I was quite surprised because through their adherence to orthodoxy, they got this idea that Russia is the beacon of Christianity in the modern world, and that Putin is, bringing his country closer to heaven while the West is going the other way. And it's a total reversal of the Reagan era, where Russia was the Red Scare and evil empire, where millions were prevented of the joy of knowing Christ, and he was determined to reverse that and put a lot of pressure on the Soviet Union to make more space for Christian beliefs and be much more interventionist and saying that people should have a freedom of religion inside the Soviet Union. And now it's kind of the other way around. A lot of Republicans see their country as a godless domain where, your kids go to school and are told about equal marriage and that abortion should be a right. So homeschooling was very popular among this group of converts. But they also had this idea that the Ukrainian government, because it was allied with this godless West, was persecuting Christians. And Marjorie Taylor Greene, who was until quite recently very close to President Trump, the representative from Georgia, was on Steve Bannon's War Room podcast saying straight out, as if it was fact, that the Ukrainian government was killing Christians and executing priests.
I think we've heard similar from Tucker Carlson as well.
Yeah, I mean, it's such a kind of perverse distortion of what's actually happening. When more than 70 religious leaders in Ukraine have been killed by Russian troops, either executed or killed in bombings or falling debris or whatever. Many have been tortured. More than 600 places of worship have been destroyed. And now finally there's this bipartisan movement which has been set up, just like I think in the last few days, to actually sort of reverse the story and show that Russia is the main perpetrator of what's going on. I think that there's the Republican lawmaker Joe Wilson who introduced the bill, saying that Putin is seeking to crush any religious groups that aren't aligned with his state-backed Orthodox Church. And the Democrat Steve Cohen is saying that, the attempts to erase Ukrainian identity through religion as well. So I feel at least finally now, when we're in the 5th year of the war, the message is finally getting out to Congress that actually, Zelensky being accused of a Nazi when he's actually Jewish was kind of quite a bizarre claim. But, he was not persecuting any religious groups. I don't think that he was particularly interested in religion, but was just concerned that the Ukrainian Orthodox Church that was linked to Moscow was a sort of Trojan horse and a way of promoting Russian world ideas inside Ukraine, which is why there's been sort of attempts to introduce legislation in Ukraine not to ban the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, as some credulous lawmakers are being told in America, but to get the bishops to come off the fence and say, yes, we stand with Ukraine and we don't embrace any of the Russian world ideology, because their situation is kind of ambiguous, to put it mildly, some of them. So, but I think it's a very difficult, it's a tightrope, because obviously Ukraine wants to be seen as a democratic country where everybody's rights are respected. So this is why it's very important to kind of write the picture. But you've heard about this shared values visa scheme, yeah? I think that's quite interesting if you're talking about some of the arch conservatives in America have actually accepted an offer to emigrate to Russia, because there they can be assured that they won't have any LGBT propaganda in their schools, that they'll be able to kind of, beat up their wives without any interference from the police, that they will have,
It should be a tough sell for the wives.
You would think so. You would think so. No, I'm exaggerating a bit, because they didn't actually put that in their literature. But they did talk about traditional values, and traditional values are often cited as a reason why women should just put up with it. But some of these characters who have moved over have come to grief. One man who ended up getting quite a big mortgage on the house he bought for his family, a Texan guy actually. And so he signed a contract with the Russian army thinking he was just going to be in the back, sort of doing some technical job, and he found himself on the front line. His wife did an impassioned sort of plea on her YouTube channel and said that she'd taken to drinking again because she said she felt her husband had been thrown to the wolves. So, and other people that have been told that Russia is some sort of utopia have faced African-American woman faced a huge torrent of racial abuse. So anyway, it hasn't been quite as successful, the take-up on this shared values visa, as the Russians may have been hoping originally.
I imagine they find the language a challenge as well.
The language.
Yeah, I mean, the constituency for the the shared values visa is probably not the constituency that's well known for speaking second languages.
Yeah, well, yeah. I mean, I think they get some help. They seem to be putting them in kind of communities with fellow nationals. So maybe they're setting up sort of like a school with English language teaching for the kids. But yeah, no, I take your point. I think it's not that easy to move to another country and learn a language, and Russian's not the easiest.
Yeah. I want to go back to Reagan for a moment. So it strikes me that what Reagan was implicitly proposing in his Evil Empire speech was a revival of the Russian church, or a need for such a revival, which in fact took place after the collapse of the Soviet Union. But as you detail at great length in the book, the Orthodox Church is deeply bound up with the centralized power of the Tsar and with Russian imperial expansion. And I'm thinking that without delving into the whole of the Russian history and half of the book, it might be worth flagging up some key moments in the history of Russian Orthodoxy that illuminate the present, whether it's Ivan the Terrible and his relationship with the Metropolitan, or Peter the Great, Catherine the Great, Tsar Nicholas I. Take your pick.
Well, yeah, no, there's a lot to choose from there. I might just talk quickly about two characters who are not rulers, who are in churchmen that, for me, embody the differences and the sort of tug of war going on inside the church. Because although my book is very critical of the church in its sort of poisonous codependent relationship with the state, I do also feel that there are some really great characters in the church. There have been in history and there are today that are trying to do their best in very difficult circumstances. But yeah, so there's Niels Sorsky is the ascetic character that you associate with Orthodoxy, that you've come across in the novels of Dostoevsky, the sort of starets, the wise elder. And he was a hermit, and he went into the forest, made friends with the wolves and the bears. People came to consult him for various life crises they had. And he felt that it was really bad to have money because riches got in the way of a conversation with God. And, you know, it was a block in the spiritual path. You know, it's easier for a camel to get through the eye of a needle than it is for a rich man to enter heaven, that kind of thinking. And then you had Joseph of Volokolamsk in the 16th century who thought the opposite. He thought the best way to celebrate God is to have loads of gold, loads of churches, loads of fields filled with serfs. To glorify God is to kind of have a lot of material possessions. And I think that we can safely say that Patriarch Kirill falls into that category because, you know, there's been a frenzy of church building in Russia, even though church is largely empty because church going, as opposed to being Orthodox, identifying Orthodox is quite low. Ivan the Terrible, very quickly, I think is very important because he was deeply religious and he wrote religious music even that has been put out on a CD. I think it was the first CD that was ever produced in the Soviet Union. But he had a totally schizophrenic relationship to religion. He would order these massacres, and then he would be beating his head in penance on the church floor until his forehead was kind of all bloodied and raw. And then he would seem very, very regretful of his actions, and then he would do them all over again. And the one cleric who did stand up to him, Metropolitan Philip, was strangled in his prison cell when he refused to bless Ivan after he massacred the people of Novgorod. So, but I think why Ivan is important today is that he founded this secret police force, the Oprichniki. And there's a fantastic novel by Vladimir Sorokin called Day of the Oprichnik, which I'm sure you've read, which is all about these characters that drove around, they rode around the country on horses with dogs' heads tied to their bridles and broomsticks, and they basically enforced the law. They were totally ruthless, and they dressed all in black, and many people sort of see a connection between them and the modern day FSB in the way that they sort of ensured that the Tsar's will be done. I think Peter the Great is really important in that he turned the church into a department of state. He basically destroyed the patriarchate, and he created instead this most holy synod, which was, run by a layperson, Oberprokurator, because he was kind of impressed by the way that the monarch was the head of the church, as he saw when he went to England to study shipbuilding. And he thought that the church was standing in the way of a lot of things and making Russia not a technological modern power in the way that he wanted it. So, he forced noblemen to shave off their beards, and if they wouldn't get rid of them, he would pull them out by the root. He made everybody dress in a more modern way. And he just found a lot of the rituals of the church very suffocating. They reminded him of his claustrophobic childhood. So he wanted to weaken the church, but he also laid the grounds for the culture of informing on your neighbour, because the priests were encouraged to report on anyone in confession that said something that might be seditious. So the priests were kind of in on the game. They were dragged in as like agents of the state, if you like. And then under Catherine, the church became a sort of tool of imperial expansion when, if Peter the Great had got the Baltic coast, she wanted to expand Russia down to the Black Sea, and by the end of her reign, most of Ukraine was part of the Russian Empire. And, she used orthodoxy as a sort of tool of conquest and forced a lot of the Greek Catholics in Western Ukraine to convert at the point of the sword. Because, she wasn't that interested in religion at the beginning of her reign. She thought that there were too many of them. She wanted to get rid of them. She also made them do more kind of work for the society in terms of educating people, creating hospitals, that kind of thing. One famous metropolitan who stood up to her, he said he didn't think it was the job of the church to teach mathematics and astronomy, but the word of the Lord. And he cast aspersions on her Orthodox faith because, she came from Germany originally, and it was a sort of Lutheran, converted to Orthodoxy. That was kind of a big red flag to her. So she had him sort of locked up. She didn't actually execute him, but he was slung into a very dank prison cell in modern-day Estonia. if she was quite skeptical about orthodoxy at the beginning, she used it. She worked out a way to kind of get it behind her imperial projects, and use it as a sort of banner to fight under. And we can certainly see some parallels with today on that front.
Yeah. So let's fast forward slightly to the Russian Revolution. So in the early days of the Russian Revolution, it looked like the church might actually regain some independence. So Peter had abolished the Patriarchate in the early 1700s. But after the revolution, the church elected a new patriarch, Patriarch Tikhon, who clashed openly with the Bolsheviks before being arrested and made to declare his loyalty. 1930s, Stalin massacred thousands of clergy, only to revive the church as a propaganda tool during the Second World War. The upshot was that for the latter part of the 20th century, even as religion was officially disapproved of by the Soviet ideology, much of the clergy was co-opted by the intelligence agencies to make sure it couldn't resist the authorities, couldn't become a center of resistance against the authorities. Tell me about Patriarch Kirill's relationship with the KGB and its successor agencies.
Yeah, I will do. Just before that, I just want to go back on Patriarch Tikhon, who became the first patriarchate since Peter the Great at the time of the revolution, because he was actually one of the good guys, and he didn't swear allegiance to the Soviet state. He was, he was thrown into prison and would have been killed if it hadn't been for intervention from outside. He was succeeded by Sergius, who said that our joys are the same as the joys of the Soviet state, and our sorrows are the same as the sorrows of the Soviet state, and sort of wedded the two together in this way. But I mean, yeah, and then actually Orthodoxy was almost wiped out until Stalin sort of decided it had to be resurrected in order to beat the Nazis in the Second World War. So the Patriarchate was re-established, as you said, in 1943.
Was Tikhon not? Was he not forced to make a public statement? I may be misremembering now.
No, that's his successor. What he was forced to. So when there was the big famine following the Civil War, he helped to kind of he donated a lot of gold from churches and asked parishioners to bring in money and everything. But when the Bolsheviks got really desperate for money, they insisted that instruments used during the liturgy should also be confiscated. Yeah. And that's when he said that shouldn't happen. And he basically excommunicated the government. He pronounced an anathema against them for doing this, because it was a violation of, everything that he held as holy.
It's a very exciting story, actually.
It is.
Delve in. Yeah.
And the parishioners that came to defend their churches, I mean, a lot of them have been forgotten. There was a lot of total horror that this desecration of churches was happening. So the Bolsheviks tried to vilify him as someone that didn't care about people dying in the famine, but that was a distortion of what was actually happening. No, it was his successor. That's why when I started researching this book, people kept talking to me about the evils of Sergianism. And I didn't know what they were talking about. And then I realized that they're talking about this character Sergius, who made this famous declaration of loyalty to the Soviet state.
Yeah, I remember that quote, yeah.
Yeah, that's the early 30s, I think. Or is it I can't remember exactly when. But it was...
I think we're probably still in the 20s.
Maybe it's still maybe it was 1928 or 27. I'm not quite sure. I have to check. But anyway, I think Tikhon was trying to do the right thing, and he was quite an enlightened patriarch. He'd spent quite a lot of time in the United States working out there for the Russian church, and he realized that he was facing a very tough job when, he basically was enthroned while the Kremlin was under attack from the Red Guards. He didn't survive very long. Anyway, but you were asking me about Kirill and his relationship with the KGB, yeah? Because his mentor, Metropolitan Nikodim, who is the youngest Christian bishop in the world at the time, was made head of this new Department of External Church Relations. And basically the post-Second World War deal was like this, the KGB said to the church, you can have a certain amount of autonomy inside Russia. You can open seminaries, you can build a few more churches, church bells can ring again, you can have some convents and monasteries. But when you go abroad, you have to tell everybody what a utopia the Soviet Union is, how, we are spreading peace, world peace, that, the invasion of Afghanistan, which was one of the first things that Kirill was accompanying Nikodim on a trip to Australia in the 70s, talking about how Russia was interested in protecting the peoples of the world and preventing nuclear war. And this whole idea, also they had to say that there was absolute religious freedom inside the Soviet Union, that anybody could go to church and worship as they liked, which obviously was not the case at all. But that was the kind of pact that was made at the time. And Kirill, first mention of him in a KGB capacity was on this trip to Australia, but then he went to serve as the representative for the World Council of Churches in Geneva. And the Swiss police were kind of clear that he was KGB, because you can see it in their files, and there's a sort of red pencil mark underneath. They called him Monsignor Kirill, with a sort of... I got sent a screenshot of the police files by a Swiss journalist who had access to them. And they knew that he had this relationship, that he was also very good friends with the Soviet consul in Geneva. They used to go on skiing trips together, who was also, working there for the KGB, as well as doing his other job. So...
a very rare privilege for a Soviet citizen.
A very rare privilege for a Soviet citizen. It gave Kirill a lifelong passion for skiing. He's made sort of, many trips to Switzerland. And he was a very popular young priest at the time, according to this consul's wife, who was interviewed in a documentary. She said that a lot of the female parishioners sort of had the hots for Kirill, because he must have had some kind of charisma about him. And he was very friendly with this family until he sort of rose quite high up the ranks and abruptly stopped answering their messages and letters, and didn't reply to the wife of this consul when she wrote to him to say her husband had died, even though they'd been very close buddies in the past, which I think tells you quite a lot about Kirill as a man, what his character is like. Sort of someone that uses people and doesn't have a very sentimental outlook on life, shall we say. Since then, his relationship with the KGB, well, he had a bit of a career low. In 1985, he was sent to Smolensk to be the bishop there, and it was a very poor diocese near the Poland-Belarusian border. Near the Belarusian border. And he looked before that like he was on a kind of stellar rise career-wise. But when he was sent there, he very quickly managed to turn things around. And although he didn't have anywhere to sleep when he first got there, and says that he was put in some horrible shack where a rat ran over his bed, pretty soon he'd taken over a building that had been the headquarters of the local KGB. So he sort of got one up on them, I think. In his relationship since then, exactly what has transpired between them will only be known, in a century or so time when the KGB archives finally get opened. But
right, when we get real glasnost one day.
Yeah. There was when I was living there in the early 90s, there was this tiny crack of glasnost when one priest, Gleb Yakunin, managed to get access to some files which showed, much to the cleric's embarrassment, that they had acted as collaborators with the KGB. Alexei, Kirill's predecessor had. His handler in Estonia sort of talked about how good he was when they had meetings and how chatty, and how he was very proactive in giving them bits of information that they found useful. So, I think being very pragmatic and wily character, because Patriarch Kirill is far more like a politician in many people's opinion than a man of the cloth. He has always kind of kept quite a good relationship with the KGB, the FSB. He opened the FSB Academy in 2012. He's given various decorations to FSB officers, patriarchal awards and such like. And then, of course, he's been totally on board with the special military operation, the takeover of Ukraine, and has found lots of different ways to justify it. But it seems that a lot of FSB officers were also refinding God, and that seemed quite strange, but it's a very definite trend that a lot of the most senior people in the FSB are also publicly, at least, devout Orthodox Christians.
It seems like a contradiction from a Western perspective, but the Russian Orthodox Church is very bound up with the idea of the glorification of the Russian state. So it seems that's how it's rationalized. Is that right?
Yeah, and the idea of defending the state and the church from enemies that want to destroy it, and the deal is that Russian Orthodoxy gets hegemony in Russia, and if any other religious affiliations seem a threat, they quite often get short shrift at the hands of the FSB. It's happened to a number of Catholic bishops that have been expelled from the country. There's a almost inexplicably hostile attitude to Jehovah's Witnesses. I suppose partly because they are seen as pacifists, because they refuse to fight. But
they're also founded in the US.
They're founded in the US. The Watchtower magazine has a picture of Brooklyn Bridge on the front, so I suppose it's sort of associated with, a the den of iniquity in New York. To burst in, to send FSB officers wearing masks and bearing arms into prayer meetings in people's houses, forcing people to strip to their underwear, sort of handcuffing them on the floor. It all seems kind of quite an over-the-top reaction to what is, quite a small group of people, mostly elderly people. But anyway, I think that there's a sense of encirclement. There's a horror or a fear of encirclement that the FSB experiences the same as the Russian state, and so they are, in a way, perfect bedfellows in that respect.
Yeah. So we touched on Reagan before. One of the big differences between the Reagan administration and the Trump administration is that Reagan, although he was never regarded as a great intellect or as having a great attention span, he was at least interested in hearing from some of the leading historians of Russia, Richard Pipes, Suzanne Massey, James Billington. By contrast, okay, we know Fiona Hill advised the Trump administration the first term. That's over. The Trump administration, by contrast, seems to want to reduce the war in Ukraine to a real estate carve-up. It's not particularly interested in history. How's that going to work out?
Yeah, I feel that, as I was saying to you earlier, I think now in America there is a kind of growing awareness of what's actually happening to religion in Ukraine, and that it's not a case that Christians are being persecuted by Volodymyr Zelensky's government, but rather the reverse. But if you're asking me sort of whether the church will continue to support the war, that is like, it feels that Kirill's made this pact with the devil, if you like, and he has, under Putin, a huge amount of money from the government has been ploughed into the church in one way or another, through historical restoration funds or different government programs. But it's come at a cost, because a lot of people that were enthusiastic about the church in the late 80s and very early 90s are now not really feeling that it's a place where they can find answers to the problems in the modern world. They're going to be treated to these rather tedious harangues that Patriarch Kirill has about the Satanism in the West. And, a lot of the ultra-Orthodox people in Russia are also the biggest hypocrites. If you think about Konstantin Malofeyev, who runs Tsargrad, which is an Orthodox, ultra-Orthodox, I should say, TV channel, fiercely nationalistic, fiercely Orthodox. But he sort of recently married, dumped his wife of 20 years or so to marry Putin's commissioner for children, Maria Lvova Bielova, who herself dumped her husband, who is a priest. They're supposed to think that marriage is a sacred right that should never be violated, but you have allegations of improper relations between one of the most powerful bishops in the Russian church, who has been accused by a young Japanese subdeacon of sexual harassment. I feel like a lot of the power, on the surface, power and glory and money and material wealth that the church has accumulated has come at the cost of debasing the church, hollowing it out, depriving it of any meaning, debasing the liturgy by making all priests recite a victory prayer. And, I follow quite closely the plight of priests who are against the war. And, quite a few of them have been defrocked, at times forced to leave the country. One of them famously for replacing the word victory with the word peace. And it does seem very Orwellian to say that if you pray for peace, you're considered a traitor and thrown out of the country. But that's the situation we're in now. And it's very hard for priests who may have big families to support, because in Russia, priests, if they get married before they're ordained straight out of the seminary, they're in the white clergy and they're expected to marry and have big families. So these people quite often don't have any other education or other source of income. They are quite reliant on the bishops above them, and they can be sort of thrown out of their jobs at the stroke of a pen, and they've got no recourse. They are among the least protected people in Russia today. So it's very hard for some of the ones who are horrified by the war, especially when they have to conduct funerals for men who come back from the battlefield in coffins, and they have to comfort the relatives. And it's hard for them to say, your husband or your son or your boyfriend died for a worthy cause, when, for all they know, this man may have committed horrendous war crimes, or may just have been murdered by a commander on his own side, as we're hearing more and more about that going on at the moment, about Russian soldiers being zeroed by their own commanders. So it's a very, very unhappy situation for the church, and those people that try to do their best and look after their communities and instill some sense of hope, I think, they face a very big uphill battle. I don't think that they get very much support, usually, from the higher-up clerics. So, it's a very difficult situation. And it's a sad situation when I think back on when I first started going to Russia and hearing about what was going on with the church. People were really excited by, the revival of Christianity, because, I went to some of the first performances of Jesus Christ Superstar, and it inspired one girl to go become a nun. That was quite an extreme reaction, but there were lots of people that would spend their weekends helping to rebuild monasteries. There were people that would spend hours on the Elektrichka, the regional train service, to get out to some obscure church where a popular priest had been exiled there by higher-up clerics to hear him preach. Intellectually, it was all in ferment. It was quite exciting. People really wanted to know how to live their lives and how to try to understand what happened in the Soviet Union, and how to, as Yeltsin put it, how to atone for the sins of the past. And it was very fashionable to get married in church at that point, and people wanted to understand about the Bible because it'd been a really hard thing to buy for years and years and years. And all of this interest and enthusiasm seems to have been turned instead into this kind of state religion presided over by the security services, which feels tragic to me.
Yeah. Before we go, I just wanted to touch on the role of historians in relation to policy making. So I mentioned in the Reagan administration, there were these very prominent historians who were brought in to advise. Your book is full of very useful information about the situation in Russia and Ukraine. I don't think you'll be getting a call from the Trump administration, so I thought you might say something about the cost of living and making policy ahistorically.
Yeah, well, I think the book that Massey did is actually something that would maybe appeal to the Trump administration, because it's very clear about the different czars that have ruled Russia, and it contains a wealth of very interesting facts that are kind of maybe easier to assimilate than some other histories. But
might give them ideas.
Yeah, I mean, to answer you seriously, I mean, there doesn't really seem a huge difference in some ways between what's going on in the Kremlin and what's going on in the White House at the moment. When you've got Pete Hegseth sort of declaring that the war in Iran has been okayed by higher forces, and, you know, there was a lot of disquiet, especially among Catholics in America, with Trump's AI pictures of him as Jesus.
It was almost Bolshevistic, wasn't it? It's like old Bolshevik anti-religious propaganda.
Yeah. Well, it did smack of that a little bit, yeah, in the sort of parody. He backpedaled later on and said that he wanted to show himself as a Red Cross worker or something like that.
Yeah.
But, yeah, I mean, I think, you know, what's going on in the Trump White House and in the Kremlin is a kind of calling black white and white black, and the facts are really kind of very rarely taken into account. And this culture of vranье in Russia, you know, of lying, sometimes with great aplomb and sometimes quite clumsily. But, you know, I think lots of people watching the television know that what they're being told about the war is not true. They know that Nazis aren't really in control of Kiev. And they know that not all the families in Ukraine consist of parent one and parent two, or whatever the propaganda puts out about dreadful contamination of LGBT plus ideology. They know that, but they don't want to know it in a way, because it's quite painful to accept that your country is attacking another country in an unprovoked invasion, and possibly committing atrocities in your name. So it's better to sort of turn away from that. And so I think, you know, demand for actual facts as opposed to tirades on Telegram, that's quite a small percentage of the population that are demanding that. They sort of put their head in the sand. And, you know, it's easier to say that people that have gone into exile and left Russia because they didn't agree with the war, that they were just opportunists looking for an easy life somewhere else. I really look forward to a very detailed history of what has been going on, and exactly who said what to who in the church, and whether it's true that Putin keeps Patriarch Kirill waiting for hours in his anteroom like he does with us journalists. You know, whether it's very much a sort of junior position. I mean, Kirill in this war has a dog in the fight. You know, he's it was a smack in the face to him as well as to Putin to lose so many parishioners and so much real estate in Ukraine. I don't know. I'd be very interested to see what future historians say about this period, but I don't think I'm going to be around to see it, unfortunately.
Well, things are changing quickly in Russia, and anything can happen.
That's definitely true. I think anyone that thinks they can predict what's going to happen with Trump or with Putin are fooling themselves. So, most of, yeah.
Yeah. Thanks, Lucy. So the book is The Baton and the Cross, Russia's Church from Pagans to Putin. You can find Lucy on X, Bluesky, Instagram. To support the Orwellian... Sorry?
LinkedIn.
I hate LinkedIn. I'm never on there. Anyway.
Oh, okay. All right. Don't worry. Sorry.
There goes their sponsorship potential. To support the Orwellians, please consider becoming a paid subscriber on the Substack. That's theorwellians.substack.com, or by making a one-time donation via the Stripe link in the show notes. You can find me on X at Roland E. Brown, Instagram at Roland Elliott Brown, my long-form articles in New Lines magazine. Thanks very much, Lucy.
Thank you.